Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Lollipop and today we are finally doing a full lineup comparison video on the Trek Dual Sport bikes. I'm going to be covering all the similarities and differences between the Dual Sport 1, 2, 3, and 4 in this video, covering everything from the suspension forks to the wheels, the seats, and the drivetrains. As always, I will be making tables that highlight all those differences in one place, but the reason why this video took so long to make is, as you can see by these multiple tables, there are barely any components that are shared between the four bikes. Now that's mainly because the Dual Sport 4 is very different from the other three bikes, but nonetheless I will compare all the components with each other. I'll give my thoughts on what each bike is best suited for at the end, but if you are interested in the differences between these 2021 Dual Sport models and the 2020 DS bikes, I have made a full video on that which I'll link right now. I have also made several other comparison videos where I compared the Dual Sport to some other bikes like the Trek Marlin or FX bikes. But the Dual Sport lineup, for those of you who do not know, is one of Trek's hybrid bike lines, which means they have wider tires than road bikes and narrower tires than mountain bikes, so they're somewhere in between the two. They're intended to work just as well on the pavement as on gravel, and can thus be used as your only bike riding on rougher roads and on light trails. There are 4 bikes in the lineup and an electric version of this bike in international markets known as the Dual Sport Plus, but I won't be covering that one in this video. There are also equipped versions of this bike with accessories pre-installed, and stagger versions which just use a different frame, though these are not available in the US and do not have any component differences in terms of performance. There are also women's versions of the Dual Sport 1, 2, and 3, but the only differences they have are a women's specific seat, some different color options, and a slightly shorter stem in some sizes, but for this video I will be focusing on the men's versions when I show the images. The women's models also come in sizes small, medium, and large, while the men's bikes also have an extra large frame size. But with that out of the way, I'm going to start off by talking about the only component that these bikes have in common with one another, and that is the Dual Sport frame. I'll throw up the frame specifications right now, but all the bikes use Trek's Alpha Gold aluminum, which is lightweight and strong, and they all have internal cable routing to look nicer and prevent cable damage. The riding position is not too upright and not too aggressive, so it works well if you're looking for a comfortable ride that can still be fast when you want it to be. All the frames are also DuoTrap S compatible, which means you can buy a separate cadence sensor that can track your fitness progress on the bike. Now let's talk about those differences. I would normally list out all the differences right now to organize what I'm going to be talking about in the video, but since basically every single component is different, I'm just going to get right into it by first talking about the price. So the Dual Sport 1 is the least expensive bike in the range, coming in at $570 or 440 pounds, while the Dual Sport 2 goes up $100 to $670 or 530 pounds, and the Dual Sport 3 goes up by $200 to $870 or 660 pounds. The Dual Sport 4 is the top of the range at $1,160 or 1,000 pounds. For component updates, I'm going to start off with the suspension fork. All of these bikes use pretty similar forks as they are all coil spring forks with 63mm of travel. The Dual Sport 1, 2, and 3 all use the SR Suntour NEX coil fork with 28mm stanchions, but only the Dual Sport 2 and 3 have a hydraulic lockout feature that allows you to manually turn a lock on the suspension so it becomes rigid. This allows for more efficient pedaling in flat areas or while going uphill, just to make you a bit faster. The Dual Sport 4 upgrades to the SR Suntour NRX RL fork, which has similar construction but uses wider 30mm stanchions for added strength and a remote lockout feature so you can just push a lever on the handlebar to lock out the fork instead of having to reach down and manually turn it. Next, I'm going to talk about the wheel set on these bikes. I'm not going to focus too much on the hubs since they are all pretty similar, but a notable difference is that the Dual Sport 4 uses center locking disc hubs, but I will discuss that more when talking about the brakes. For the rims though, the Dual Sport 1 and 2 both use the entry-level Bontrager connection rims, which are not tubeless ready and use Schrader valves, while the Dual Sport 3 upgrades to the tubeless ready Bontrager rims with Presta valves. The DualSport 4 upgrades further to the Bontrager Affinity tubeless ready rims, which are similar in specifications but just have some better construction. The tires are similar as well, since all the bikes use 700 by 40C wire bead 60 TPI tires that are not tubeless ready. The only difference is that the DS1 and 2 use the Bontrager GR1 Comp tires, while the DS3 and 4 go to the Bontrager GR1 Expert tires, which use Trek's hard case light system that provides better puncture protection against thorns and other sharp objects on the road or on the trail. The bikes also use different seats, as the DS1 and 2 use the Bontrager Sport Saddle, while the DualSport 3 goes to the firmer and slightly sportier Bontrager H1 seat, and the DualSport 4 uses the even sportier Bontrager Evoque. The seat posts are also very similar, as the DualSport 1, 2, and 3 all use the entry-level Bontrager alloy seat post, but the DS4 upgrades to the Bontrager Comp post, which is just a bit lighter. And now we have some component differences in the cockpit. The DS1 uses Bontrager riser steel handlebars that have a 30mm rise for a more upright seating position, while the DualSport 2 goes to the Bontrager alloy 15mm rise handlebar, and the DS3 and 4 use the Bontrager Comp low riser bars, which have a 15mm rise as well. All of the bars are 600mm wide in sizes small and medium, and 660mm wide in sizes large and extra large, though the DualSport 1 uses 620mm wide bars for those larger sizes. And as you progress up the range, the handlebars mainly just get lighter in weight. Then the grips are also slightly different, as the DS1 and 2 use the basic Bontrager satellite grips that slip on the handlebars, while the DualSport 3 and 4 go to the Bontrager XR Endurance Elite grips that are more ergonomic and are easier to take on and off the bike because of their lock-on design. And the last part of the cockpit is the stem, which isn't too different between the bikes, but the DS1 uses a Bontrager alloy 10-degree stem, while the DS2 uses a Bontrager alloy 7-degree stem for a slightly sportier riding position, and the top two models use the Bontrager Elite 7-degree stem, which is just a bit lighter in weight. Next, we have the brake set. All the bikes use 160mm wide front and rear brake rotors, but the DualSport 1 uses Tektro mechanical disc brakes, while the DualSport 2 uses Tektro hydraulic disc brakes, and the other two models use Shimano MT200 hydraulic disc brakes. All of these brakes are pretty entry level, though the DualSport 4 does use center locking disc rotors instead of bolt-on rotors, which are more resistant to warping. Hydraulic disc brakes are also much better than mechanical disc brakes since they have better stopping power, require less maintenance after being set up, and they work better in all weather conditions, so that is something to consider. And the final component group we have is the drivetrain, which consists of several different components like the shifters, the cranksets, and the cassettes. Before I talk about those individual components though, I'm going to discuss the drivetrains as a whole. So the DualSport 1 uses a mixed 3x7 drivetrain with mostly entry-level Shimano components, which means it has 3 gears or chainrings in the front crankset and 7 gears or cogs in the rear cassette. This allows the bike to have a total of 21 speeds. The DS2 also uses a mixed Shimano drivetrain, but this time it uses 8 gears in the rear for a 24-speed system. The DS3 cuts that down by going to a mainly Shimano Acera and Alivio 2x9 drivetrain, which should have plenty of gears for most types of riding. And lastly, the DualSport 4 uses a mainly Shimano Dior M50-100 1x11 drivetrain, which is also seen on mountain bikes. So it's a great drivetrain for light trail use or road riding, though it may not have all the speeds one might prefer if you tend to stick to the road. However, now let's get into the actual components to really highlight some of those drivetrain differences. Starting with the shifters, there isn't too much to talk about here besides the fact that all of them do allow you to shift up to 3 gears at a time to move to an easier gear for climbing in the rear cassette, and they definitely have some better quality components and designs moving up the range, and you will notice some smoother and more precise shifting. For the front derailleurs, the DS1 and 2 use entry-level Shimano tourney derailleurs, which get the job done, but the Acera in the DS3 has a better design that works a bit smoother and is more reliable. The DS4 only has one chainring in the front, so it does not have a front derailleur, which can be nice since that's another moving part that could potentially malfunction while riding. However, every bike does have a rear derailleur, and they progressively get better in quality as we go from the DS1 to the DS4. None of these derailleurs are too bad, but the Dior in the DualSport 4 has a clutch, which means that the chain is tensioned further to prevent it from falling off the bike or skipping gears. Besides that, the higher end derailleurs will just be more reliable and shift smoother for a longer time. For the crankset, the DualSport 1 and 2 use the same 3 chainring forged alloy crank, which has 48 teeth on the largest chainring, 38 teeth in the middle one, and 28 on the smallest. The DS3 goes to the Shimano MT210 crankset, which just has 46 teeth on the larger chainring and 30 on the smaller, and the DualSport 4 has a single chainring Pro Wheel alloy 42-tooth crank. For the cassettes, the DualSport 1 actually uses a Sunrace brand freewheel instead of a cassette, which is just less expensive and has a narrower gear range of 14 to 34 teeth, but the DS2 upgrades to the Shimano HG31 cassette with 11 to 32 teeth, so a slightly wider range, and then the DualSport 3 upgrades even further to the Shimano HG200 11 to 36 tooth cassette. The DS4 has the widest range in the rear with its 11 to 51 tooth Shimano Dior cassette, which is necessary because the bike only has one chainring in the front and thus less gears for efficient uphill climbing, though this drivetrain should be fine for most uses. Now finally, the last difference I'll discuss is the weight of each bike. The DualSport 1 is the heaviest at 13.73 kilograms or 30.26 pounds, and then the DS2 cuts down a pound to 13.18 kilograms or 29.05 pounds, but the DS3 actually increases a bit more to 13.45 kilograms or 29.66 pounds. The DualSport 4 is definitely the lightest at 12.48 kilograms or 27.52 pounds. And those are all the component differences between the 4 DualSport models. I'm going to show all of those completed tables highlighting those changes right now, while I talk about what each of these bikes is best suited for in my opinion. The DS1 is definitely more for the commuter on rougher roads or for someone who needs to get to and from work or school comfortably and on a reliable bike, though it can definitely serve as a nice bike to go on some light trails with. The DS2 upgrades some components on the DS1 to make it more reliable, smoother, and lighter in weight to make that ride that much more comfortable and fast. The DS3 is the most popular bike out of all of these, I'd say, since it has some nicer components and a better drivetrain with less speeds, but still definitely enough speeds for commuting and light trail riding. The DualSport 4 is the top-end model, and I'd say that this bike is more focused on the light trail riding aspect of the hybrid bike rather than the road riding, though it is still definitely able to do both. I'd say get the DualSport 4 if you know you're going to be going on trails or on rougher terrain more often, but the DualSport 3 should be totally fine for most people looking into the DualSport range. The DualSport 1 is good if you're on a tighter budget, but the DualSport 2 is probably a better entry-level DualSport bike to start off on. But overall, my favorite bike out of these 4 is definitely the DualSport 3 for its drivetrain and higher end components that still keep the bike at a lower price point as compared to the DualSport 4, which increases significantly. And with that, I hope all of you enjoyed this video, and of course, please leave any questions or suggestions in the comments below. But as always, thank you all so much for watching, and remember to keep biking.